In the heart of the world's greatest empire, they were more than priestesses. They were living goddesses, symbols of Rome's purity and permanence. Chosen as children, they were given immense privilege and honor, walking among senators and emperors as equals. But their sacred duty came at a terrible price. For 30 years, they belonged to the state, bound by a holy vow of chastity. And if that vow was broken, they faced a fate so horrifying, it was designed to erase them from existence. This is the story of the Vestal Virgins and the terrifying secret buried at the heart of their sacred lives. To be chosen as a Vestal was one of the highest honors a Roman family could know. The selection process was rigorous. A girl had to be between 6 and 10 years old, free of any physical or mental defects, and from a high-ranking patrician family where both parents were still living. In a formal ceremony, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief high priest, would take the girl by the hand and utter the words, "I take you, Amata, to be a Vestal priestess." With that single sentence, she was no longer a child of her family, but a daughter of the state. She would leave her home and enter the exclusive house of the Vestals, beginning a 30-year term of service. The first 10 years were for learning their sacred duties. The next 10 were for performing them, and the final 10 were for teaching the next generation. Their central duty, the one upon which the fate of Rome was believed to rest, was to tend the sacred fire in the Temple of Vesta. This eternal flame was the symbol of the city's hearth and home. If it ever went out, it was considered a catastrophic omen, a sign that the goddess Vesta had abandoned her people. The Vestal responsible for letting the flame die would be stripped and scourged by the Pontifex Maximus in the dark. But their duties didn't end there. They also prepared the asterisk mola salsa asterisk, a sacred salted flour used in countless public rituals, and guarded Rome's most precious relics, including the legendary Palladium, a statue said to have been rescued from the fall of Troy and which guaranteed the city a safety. In exchange for their devotion, the Vestals were granted unparalleled freedoms for women in Rome. They were not subject to their father's authority, could own property, write their own wills, and vote. They were so trusted that even emperors and powerful generals like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony entrusted their wills and state documents to their keeping. They had seats of honor at public games and ceremonies, and were transported through the city in carriages, a right reserved for only the most important officials. To harm a Vestal was a capital crime. Their very presence could pardon a condemned criminal on their way to execution, should their paths cross by chance. But all these privileges depended on one thing: their virginity. Their purity was mystically linked to the health and safety of the Roman state. A Vestal's vow of chastity was absolute. To break it was not just a personal sin. It was an act of treason and sacrilege that polluted the entire city. It was believed to invite disaster and the wrath of the gods. When military defeats or plagues struck the empire, suspicion would often fall upon the Vestals. Had one of them broken her vow and angered the heavens? And the punishment for this crime was one of the most chilling rituals in Roman history. A Vestal found guilty of breaking her vow was condemned to be buried alive. Because her body was sacred, it could not be violated by a common executioner. So, a legal loophole was devised. She would be taken to a place called the Campus Salaritus, the evil field. There, a small underground chamber was prepared, containing a bed, a lamp, and a small amount of bread, water, and milk, just enough so that the state was not technically guilty of starving her to death. Dressed in funeral clothes, the condemned Vestal was carried through a silent mourning city and led down into her tomb. The entrance was then sealed, and she was left alone in the darkness, entombed within the earth to die, her sacred status preserved while her life was extinguished. Her supposed lover would be publicly flogged to death in the Roman Forum. It was a brutal and terrifying message to all who watched. The historian Plutarch describes the procession as one of the most dreadful sights the city could witness. After 30 years of service, a Vestal was free to leave the order and even marry. However, Most chose to remain in the sisterhood, having known no other life. They had become accustomed to their status, power, and independence privileges they would have to surrender as a conventional Roman wife under the authority of a husband. The lives of the Vestals were a paradox of power and peril. They were the most revered women in Rome, yet they were also prisoners of their sacred duty. Their story reveals the deep-seated beliefs and fears of the Roman world, a world where the fate of an empire could rest on the purity of its priestesses, and where the punishment for transgression was a descent into living death. The Temple of Vesta now stands in ruins, but the eternal flame of its story continues to fascinate and horrify us. What do you think of this extreme tradition? Let me know in the comments below. And for more stories from the shadows of history, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.